Picture this. The most powerful man in 9th century England, a king who had united warring kingdoms and driven back Viking hordes, suddenly doubles over in agony during a royal feast. His screams echo through the great hall as courtiers watch in horror. The pain is so intense that guards rush to his aid, thinking he's been poisoned. But this isn't an assassination attempt. This is just Tuesday for Alfred the Great. What you're witnessing is one of countless episodes that would plague England's most celebrated monarch for over 2 decades. An illness so mysterious, so relentless, and so devastating that it would transform a warrior king into a man who lived in constant fear of his own body. This is the story of how Alfred the Great achieved legendary status while battling an enemy far more terrifying than any Viking army. An enemy that lived inside him, waiting to strike without warning, without mercy, and without end. Welcome to the untold, horrifying medical mystery that history almost forgot. Alfred the Great is remembered as one of England's greatest monarchs. He's the only English king to bear the title the Great. A man who transformed a fractured land into a unified kingdom, established the first English navy, revolutionized education, and created a legal system that would influence law for centuries. But behind every triumph, every military victory, every moment of political brilliance, lurked a terror that modern medicine has only recently begun to understand. For 20+ years, Alfred lived with a condition that would suddenly and without warning transform him from a commanding ruler into a writhing, screaming victim of his own anatomy. The attacks were so severe that medieval chroniclers struggled to find words to describe them. Court physicians were baffled. Religious advisors declared it divine punishment. But Alfred himself? He knew it was something far worse. It was a prison sentence, and his own body was the cell. What makes Alfred's story truly remarkable isn't just that he achieved greatness despite this condition. It's that he achieved it while living in constant anticipation of the next attack. Imagine commanding armies while knowing that at any moment you might collapse in agony. Picture negotiating treaties while your body betrays you without warning. This is the untold story of how a man conquered kingdoms while being conquered by his own flesh. The year was 868 AD, and 20-year-old Alfred was about to marry Ealhswith of Mercia in what should have been a celebration of political alliance and personal joy. Medieval weddings were grand affairs, especially royal ones, filled with feasting, ceremony, and the promise of dynasty. But as Alfred stood before his bride-to-be, something went catastrophically wrong. According to the detailed accounts of his biographer Asser, Alfred was suddenly seized by what can only be described as excruciating torment. Not the nervous flutter of wedding jitters. This was physical agony so intense that the ceremony had to be halted. Guests watched in stunned silence as their future king was reduced to a writhing, helpless figure. His face contorted in a mask of pain that would become all too familiar in the years to come. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. This was the beginning of what would become Alfred's lifetime companion, an invisible torturer that would follow him from the wedding altar to the battlefield, from the throne room to his private chambers, never predictable, always devastating. The medieval mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. In an age where illness was often attributed to divine displeasure or demonic possession, Alfred's condition defied easy explanation. The pain wasn't constant. It came in waves, in attacks that could last minutes or hours, leaving Alfred temporarily incapacitated before vanishing as mysteriously as they had arrived. Between episodes, he appeared perfectly healthy, which only added to the mystery and terror surrounding his condition. What made this particularly cruel was the timing. Alfred was entering the prime of his life, preparing to take on the enormous responsibility of defending England against Viking invasions. He needed to project strength, command respect, and lead armies into battle. Instead, He was learning that his own body could become his greatest enemy at any moment, without warning, without reason, and without mercy. The young prince, not yet king, began to understand that he was facing something far more formidable than any external foe. Vikings could be fought with swords and shields. Political enemies could be outmaneuvered with cunning and alliances. But how do you fight an enemy that lives inside you? How do you defend against attacks that come from within your own flesh? As Alfred's wedding finally proceeded after the episode subsided, those present couldn't have known they were witnessing the beginning of one of history's most remarkable stories of triumph over physical adversity. They were seeing a young man who would have to learn to rule a kingdom while his own body waged war against him. A war that would continue for the rest of his life. By 871 AD, Alfred had become King of Wessex, inheriting not just a crown but a kingdom under siege. The great heathen army, a massive Viking force, was systematically conquering English kingdoms, and Wessex was next on their list. This should have been Alfred's moment to prove himself as a warrior king, to lead from the front like his predecessors. Instead, he found himself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Vikings and another against the invisible enemy within. The Battle of Ashdown in 871 AD became legendary for Alfred's tactical brilliance, but what the chronicles don't fully capture is the sheer terror he must have felt. Not of Viking axes and spears, but of his own body betraying him at the crucial moment. Imagine commanding thousands of warriors while knowing that at any second, you might collapse in agony before them all. Picture the psychological warfare this condition waged on his mind every single day. But it wasn't just the timing that made Alfred's illness so horrifying. It was the nature of the attacks themselves. According to Asser's detailed accounts, when the episode struck, Alfred would be seized by pain so intense that it was visible to everyone around him. His face would contort, his body would convulse, and he would cry out in ways that left witnesses deeply disturbed. These weren't subtle symptoms that could be hidden or downplayed. They were dramatic, unmistakable displays of human suffering. The unpredictability was perhaps the cruelest aspect. Alfred could never know when the next attack would come. He might wake up feeling perfectly normal, attend court, make critical decisions, and then suddenly be reduced to a helpless victim of his own anatomy. Council meetings would be interrupted. Military campaigns would be delayed. State functions would come to a grinding halt as the King of England writhed in unexplainable agony. What's particularly chilling is how this affected Alfred's relationship with his own body. In an age when physical strength was synonymous with leadership, when a king was expected to be the strongest warrior in his realm, Alfred was learning that his flesh was unreliable, treacherous, and actively working against him. He couldn't trust the vessel that carried his mind and spirit. The very body he needed to project royal authority was the same body that could humiliate him without warning. The psychological impact was staggering. Alfred began living in a state of constant anticipation, always waiting for the next attack. Every important meeting, every battle, every moment of his reign was shadowed by the knowledge that his invisible enemy might strike at any moment. It was like being stalked by a predator that lived inside his own skin. Always present, always threatening, always unpredictable. Yet somehow, impossibly, Alfred continued to function as king. He continued to make the decisions that would save England from Viking conquest. He continued to inspire loyalty in his followers despite, or perhaps because of, his obvious vulnerability. But the cost was enormous, and it was about to get much worse. As Alfred's reign progressed through the 870s and 880s, his condition didn't improve. It evolved, becoming even more mysterious and terrifying. What had begun as episodic attacks of severe pain started to manifest in ways that baffled everyone who witnessed them. The symptoms were so varied and seemingly unconnected that medieval physicians were completely at a loss. According to the detailed records kept by his court, Alfred's attacks began to follow a pattern that was somehow both predictable and utterly unpredictable. They often struck during times of stress, before major battles, during important negotiations, at crucial political moments. Yet they also came during periods of calm, turning peaceful evenings into nights of agony. It was as if the condition had developed an almost sadistic intelligence, striking when it would cause maximum disruption and distress. The nature of the pain itself defied medieval understanding. This wasn't the straightforward agony of a battle wound or the familiar suffering of common diseases like fever or consumption. Alfred's pain seemed to move through his body in waves, concentrating in his abdomen before radiating outward. Witnesses described seeing him doubled over, clutching his midsection, his face pale and contorted with an expression of suffering that was difficult to look upon. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what happened between attacks. Alfred would recover completely, not gradually as one might expect after severe illness, but suddenly and totally. One moment he would be incapacitated by pain, the next he would be perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened. This rapid recovery was almost more unsettling than the attacks themselves, because it meant that everyone around him, including Alfred himself, lived in constant uncertainty about when the next episode would strike. The medieval medical establishment was entirely unprepared to deal with such a condition. Physicians of the time relied on the theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, to explain illness. They believed that disease resulted from imbalances in these bodily fluids, and their treatments involved trying to restore harmony through bloodletting, purging, and dietary restrictions. None of these approaches had any effect on Alfred's condition whatsoever. Religious explanations proved equally inadequate. Some clerics suggested that Alfred was being tested by God, like Job in the Old Testament. Others wondered if he was being punished for some unknown sin. But Alfred was known for his piety, his devotion to learning, and his just rule. If this was divine punishment, what could he possibly have done to deserve such prolonged torment? The lack of any effective treatment meant that Alfred had to develop his own coping mechanisms. He learned to recognize the early warning signs of an approaching attack, subtle changes in sensation that preceded the onset of full agony. He began structuring his schedule around the possibility of sudden incapacitation, always ensuring that trusted advisors could take over if he became unable to function. Most remarkably, Alfred refused to let his condition define his reign. Even as his mysterious illness continued to strike without warning or mercy, he pressed forward with his revolutionary reforms of English society, law, and education. But the psychological toll was becoming increasingly evident to those closest to him. By the 890s, Alfred had been battling his mysterious condition for over 2 decades, and the cumulative effect was beginning to reshape not just his physical existence, but his entire worldview. This wasn't simply a matter of enduring periodic pain. It was about living every single day with the knowledge that his own body could turn against him without warning, transforming him from a commanding king into a helpless victim in mere moments. The psychological architecture Alfred built to cope with this reality was as complex as any medieval fortress. He had to simultaneously maintain the confidence and authority necessary to rule a kingdom while internally preparing for the possibility that he might collapse in agony at any moment. This required a kind of mental compartmentalization that few humans have ever been forced to develop. Consider what this meant in practical terms. When Alfred entered a council meeting to discuss military strategy against Viking raids, he wasn't just thinking about troop movements and battle plans. He was also calculating the probability that he might suddenly be seized by excruciating pain in front of his military commanders. When he held court to dispense justice, he had to project the serene authority of a wise ruler while knowing that his face might shortly be contorted in a mask of agony that would horrify the petitioners seeking his judgment. The condition affected every aspect of his daily routine. Alfred learned to eat carefully, avoiding foods that seemed to trigger attacks. He developed elaborate protocols for his personal servants, ensuring that someone was always nearby who could assist him if he was suddenly incapacitated. He even modified the layout of his living quarters, making sure he was never far from a private space where he could suffer through an episode without being observed by the general court. But perhaps most heartbreaking was how the condition affected Alfred's relationship with his own accomplishments. Every victory over the Vikings, every successful reform, every moment of triumph was shadowed by the knowledge that it had been achieved despite his body's betrayal. He couldn't simply enjoy success. He had to be grateful that his invisible enemy had allowed him to function long enough to achieve it. The isolation was profound. While Alfred was surrounded by courtiers, advisors, and family members, none of them could truly understand what it meant to live in constant anticipation of unpredictable agony. They could witness his attacks, they could offer sympathy and support, but they couldn't share the psychological burden of never knowing when the next episode would strike. Alfred was fundamentally alone with his suffering, carrying the weight of both a kingdom and an incomprehensible medical condition. Yet somehow, impossibly, this period saw some of Alfred's greatest achievements. He established the first systematic navy in English history, created a network of fortified towns called Buzz that would revolutionize defense against Viking raids, and initiated educational reforms that would transform English culture. It was as if the constant threat of physical incapacitation had sharpened his focus, creating an urgency that drove him to accomplish more, not less, than might otherwise have been possible. The irony was staggering. Alfred the Great's greatest years of achievement coincided with his deepest suffering. The very condition that threatened to destroy him seemed, paradoxically, to be driving him toward greatness. As Alfred's condition persisted year after year with no improvement, the desperate search for a cure became one of the defining obsessions of his reign. This wasn't just about personal suffering. The health of the king was considered directly connected to the health of the kingdom. Alfred's mysterious illness wasn't just his private torment. It was a matter of national security. The court physicians exhausted every treatment known to medieval medicine. They tried bloodletting, believing that Alfred's pain resulted from an excess of hot, corrupt blood that needed to be drained from his system. They attempted purging with powerful herbal concoctions designed to expel whatever poisonous substances might be causing his agony. They experimented with dietary restrictions, eliminating various foods in hopes of identifying a trigger. None of these approaches provided any relief whatsoever. Religious remedies were pursued with equal desperation. Alfred made pilgrimages to holy sites, hoping for divine intervention. He commissioned prayers from monasteries across his kingdom, believing that the combined spiritual power of hundreds of monks might overcome whatever force was tormenting him. He even consulted with hermits and holy men who claimed to have special insight into spiritual afflictions. The results were uniformly disappointing. Perhaps most tellingly, Alfred began seeking advice from foreign physicians and healers. This was unusual for a king who was fiercely proud of English independence and suspicious of foreign influence. But his desperation was so complete that he was willing to try remedies from Viking shamans, Irish druids, and continental physicians who claimed expertise in mysterious ailments. Each new treatment raised hopes that were inevitably crushed when the next attack struck. The failure of every attempted cure created a psychological torture that ran parallel to the physical agony. Alfred wasn't just enduring incomprehensible pain. He was enduring the repeated disappointment of false hope. Each new physician, each promising remedy, each confident prediction of recovery was followed by the inevitable reality that his invisible enemy remained undefeated and undiminished. This medical odyssey also revealed something crucial about Alfred's character. Lesser individuals might have retreated from public life, using their condition as an excuse to withdraw from the demanding responsibilities of kingship. But Alfred seemed to become more determined with each failed treatment. If he couldn't cure his condition, he would simply have to achieve greatness despite it. If his body was going to betray him regardless, he might as well accomplish something worthy while he suffered. The court records from this period show an almost manic productivity. While Alfred was privately struggling with physicians and remedies, he was publicly implementing reforms at a pace that seems almost impossible. He was writing legal codes, establishing schools, commissioning translations of classical texts, and planning military campaigns with an intensity that suggested he was racing against time. Perhaps because he never knew how much functional time he would have before the next attack struck. By the late 890s, Alfred had essentially given up hope of finding a cure. The search for relief had consumed enormous resources and created repeated cycles of hope and disappointment that were almost as cruel as the original condition. He had been forced to accept a terrible reality. He would live with this invisible torturer for the rest of his life, achieving whatever he could in the intervals between attacks, always knowing that his greatest enemy was carried within his own flesh. As Alfred entered the final decade of his life in the 890s, his mysterious condition had evolved from an episodic torment into something resembling a constant companion. While the acute attacks continued to strike without warning, the cumulative effect of decades of unpredictable suffering had begun to reshape not just his body but his entire approach to existence. The king who had once been described as vigorous and physically imposing now appeared worn down by his invisible battle. Court observers noted that Alfred had developed a kind of hypervigilance, constantly monitoring his own physical sensations for the early warning signs of an approaching attack. He had learned to read his body like a weather forecaster reads storm clouds, always watching for the subtle changes that preceded the onset of agony. But rather than retreating into invalidism, Alfred seemed to intensify his focus on legacy, perhaps recognizing that his time was limited, not just by his mysterious illness but by the normal span of human life. He embarked on what can only be described as a frantic effort to complete his transformation of English society. He worked with an urgency that his courtiers found both inspiring and concerning, as if he was racing to finish some enormous task before time ran out. The most remarkable aspect of this period was how Alfred had learned to function during partial episodes, where once he had been completely incapacitated during attacks, he had developed techniques for continuing to work even while experiencing significant pain. Court records show instances where he dictated correspondence while clearly suffering, his voice strained but his mind still sharp and focused. It was as if he had learned to compartmentalize his consciousness, allowing one part of his awareness to deal with physical agony while another part continued the business of ruling a kingdom. This extraordinary adaptation came at a tremendous cost. The constant stress of living with unpredictable pain had clearly affected Alfred's overall health. He appeared older than his years, and those closest to him reported that he seemed perpetually exhausted, not from any single attack, but from the cumulative burden of decades of suffering. It was as if his body was slowly wearing out from the constant internal warfare it was forced to endure. Yet even in this diminished state, Alfred's intellectual powers remained formidable. Some of his most sophisticated writings date from this period, including philosophical reflections on the nature of suffering, the responsibilities of leadership, and the relationship between physical weakness and spiritual strength. It's almost as if his condition had forced him to develop insights that would have been impossible for someone who had never experienced such prolonged adversity. The final years also saw Alfred become something of a source of inspiration for others suffering from mysterious or chronic conditions. Word of the king's struggle with his invisible enemy had spread throughout the kingdom, and people began to see him as proof that it was possible to achieve greatness despite physical limitation. This was perhaps the most unexpected consequence of his decades of suffering. Alfred the Great had inadvertently become Alfred the Endurer, a symbol of human resilience in the face of incomprehensible adversity. As death approached in 899 AD, those around Alfred noted that he seemed almost relieved. The man who had spent over 30 years living in fear of his next attack was finally approaching an end to his suffering. His mysterious condition had been his constant companion through the most remarkable reign in early English history, and now both king and illness would finally find rest together. Alfred the Great died on October 26, 899 AD, taking his mysterious illness to the grave with him. For over 1,000 years, historians, physicians, and scholars have debated what condition could have caused such prolonged, episodic agony while allowing its victim to achieve such extraordinary accomplishments. The medieval chronicles provide detailed descriptions of Alfred's suffering but lack the medical vocabulary to offer a precise diagnosis. Modern medical analysis of the historical evidence points to a condition that was completely unknown to 9th century physicians. Crohn's disease, a chronic inflammatory bowel disorder that causes exactly the type of episodic, severe abdominal pain that Alfred experienced. The timing of attacks during periods of stress, the complete recovery between episodes, the inability of medieval treatments to provide any relief, all of these details align perfectly with what we now know about inflammatory bowel diseases. If this diagnosis is correct, it means that Alfred the Great achieved his legendary status while battling one of the most challenging chronic conditions known to medicine. Crohn's disease is debilitating enough for modern patients who have access to sophisticated pain management, anti-inflammatory medications, and specialized medical care. Alfred endured it with nothing but his own determination and whatever primitive remedies medieval medicine could provide. The implications are staggering. Every victory over the Vikings, every innovative law, every educational reform, every moment of Alfred's reign that earned him the title the Great was accomplished while he lived in constant anticipation of his next attack. He united England, established its first navy, revolutionized its legal system, and transformed its educational infrastructure, all while his own body waged relentless war against him. Perhaps most remarkably, Alfred never allowed his condition to become an excuse for reduced expectations or diminished achievement. He could have easily retreated from the demanding responsibilities of kingship, using his mysterious illness as justification for a quieter, less ambitious life. Instead, he seemed to draw strength from his suffering, using the constant reminder of his own mortality and vulnerability as motivation to accomplish more, not less. In the end, Alfred the Great's most extraordinary victory wasn't over the Vikings or rival kingdoms. It was over his own body. He proved that human greatness isn't diminished by physical limitation but can actually be forged in the crucible of chronic suffering. His invisible enemy, the condition that tormented him for decades, ultimately became the forge in which his greatness was shaped. The boy who collapsed in agony on his wedding day grew up to become the only English king worthy of the title the Great. His mysterious illness, the condition that should have destroyed him, instead became the hidden foundation of his legendary resilience. Alfred didn't conquer his invisible enemy. He learned to achieve greatness despite it, proving that the human spirit can triumph over any adversity, no matter how mysterious, unpredictable, or cruel. Today, as we understand more about chronic conditions like Crohn's disease, Alfred's story takes on even greater significance. He stands as perhaps history's greatest example of accomplishment despite chronic illness, a reminder that physical suffering doesn't have to define the limits of human achievement. The king who couldn't escape his own body ultimately escaped the limitations that condition might have imposed, leaving behind a legacy that has inspired people for over 1,000 years. Alfred the Great conquered kingdoms, but his greatest conquest was himself. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane, untold historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, like, share and comment below. What other untold historical story would you like me to reveal? See you in the next one.